Is how did you get involved with border crossing?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure I can give you a categorical answer. And that immediately might create problems in some people's minds, but in my mind, that's a good thing. Because it suggests that it's more over time, osmotic, relational, not to do with a specific piece of business. I became aware of Michael as a particular artist working in theatre and working transnationally in theatre. And because I had made a decision to also work transnationally in theatre as an individual theatre artist, mostly one tends to think of the theatre sector in terms of institutions and companies. And what I sensed somehow was a kind of kindred spirit, if you like, in Michael's vision and the fact that he was working often outside of mainstream UK institutional structures with a different kind of politics and a different kind of economics. And because I'd set up the Fence network in 2003, I think what would happen is I would see Michael across certain kinds of gatherings, formal or informal, and sort of became aware of him and sort of started to become aware of border crossings as the thing that he did. And then we would start probably to have dinner once a year, just so we could kind of informally catch up on each other's work and how things were going. And I think for me, it was as much an act of solidarity as anything else to say, there aren't that many of us working in this way, freelance, or as small entities with a group of supporting people around us. And so why wouldn't we meet informally to exchange ideas, experiences, sometimes very practical things like how are you getting on with your Creative Europe program, how are you getting on with your Erasmus project, what are the things that you're encountering, you know, and the various kind of iterations of the agencies and how they behave and whether that was fundamentally enabling or disabling. And then, of course, at a certain point, you start to meet the person behind the work, and you realise that in addition to that commonality, we both have autistic children. And so that then adds a parallel narrative of connectivity, if you like. Harry and Amber are slightly younger than my boy Gabriel, who's 27 now. But, you know, there is a community of parents and carers of autistic young people who very much dynamically exchange knowledge, thinking, solidarity. So in a way, that sort of single thread quickly became a double thread, where I was interested in Michael in his professional life, but also in how he managed being a dad of an autistic child, in this case, two autistic children. So that's how it started, I think, really, was my sense that Michael was somehow a kindred spirit. And that, you know, and there are more now, I would say. There are more people now, 25 years, 20 years later, than there were then. The ground has become, in some ways, it's become more complicated and more competitive and more difficult and more pernicious economically. But there are more people who are interested in working in different kinds of ways, who are interested in working across languages, across boundaries. So I'm very encouraged by that. But at the time, you know, I wasn't having many of those conversations in that way with people like Michael.
And how did that make you feel to find someone like Michael? There's this kinship in in your personal life, and also how did that happen to be a creative conversation?
Well, if I go back to the fence network that I set up, I set it up when I was director of what was a grassroots national organisation, initially called New Playwrights Trust, and then entering into the digital age, it morphed into WriterNet. And I was director of that organisation for 15 years between 1994 and 2009. And I had a remit, we had a remit to diversify the playwriting landscape of the UK from the bottom up. So a lot of work with global majority writers, a lot of work with women writers, with LGBTQ plus writers, with disabled writers. But part of diversification, at least in my mind, was also to ask questions around the internationalization of practice and somehow to contest and challenge the sort of simple monoglot hegemony of the English language, and the fact that up until very recently, and still really, from an institutional level, we are incredibly lazy. We're very gifted in terms of a playwriting culture because Shakespeare is such a global touchstone, and because English has been the dominant language globally for so long. In that sense, playwrights luxuriate in a relatively strong playwriting culture in the UK. But there's a laziness that comes with that, which is that if we're not producing work written by UK-based playwrights, we look across the pond to the United States and occasionally to Australia and Canada and other Anglophone countries. But our willingness to engage with the playwriting corpus globally was certainly 25 years ago much more problematic and limited. So that was one of the kind of challenges that I thought it might be useful to try to address. But I wanted to do so in a way that focused on the individual artist and not on the institution. So you can see how that vision might start to come towards some of the things that Michael has been preoccupied in his career over the last 30 years as a theatre maker working with indigeneity, but also working across languages and borders. And whilst my focus was on the playwright and then, I suppose, dramaturgs and theatre makers attendant around the playwright, if you like, some of the things that I encountered as a small quasi-autonomous unit doing things in different parts of first Europe and then further afield, you could see how there would be synergies between what I was doing. So someone else that I could introduce into the conversation, Josephine Burton, working with Dash, for example, over a similar kind of time period. It tends to be coffee or lunch rather than dinner with her. But again, and not even every year, but I'd meet Josephine in Tbilisi at a theatre festival and sit in a club at 1 a.m. and have that conversation with her. And so there are people that one would meet, often not in this country, working internationally. And so a bit like Josephine, we start to explore the commonality, and at some point you might then decide you want to work together. But it starts through a mutual curiosity, a mutual passion, and I think a sense of shared solidarity, because what you're doing is quite niche, quite special, quite challenging sometimes in terms of the fact that really you have to understand the relationship between the aesthetics, the politics and the economics. And you've got to think about the interrelationship between those three and how they work in a very particular way, if you're fundamentally a kind of either individual or very small unit.
And before I move on to what happened when you worked together,
Yeah.
you said something there was a similarity in the fact that you and Border Crossing were working outside of institutions. What do you mean?
Well, we constantly work with institutions, but I was very clear in conceptualizing the fence that it was about individual artists and individual sensibilities, and that it was a relational rather than transactional network. Of course, transactions would follow, but they needed to flow from the relationships that people made with each other. That's a distributed, divergent model that fundamentally brings people together in order for them to go away and determine who's interesting and find out how they want to work together and go and do that. And that's not the same way as Michael works, because in a way everything goes through Michael's mind, and that's kind of fine. But if we set that aside for a moment, it seems to me that his process is always about redistributing that. And so there is a kind of movement between convergence and divergence that I sort of recognise in my own practice. I trained as the theatre director. I'm married to someone who teaches theatre directing and acting. That's enough directing in one family. I stopped directing a long time ago. Occasionally I kind of get back on that horse at a kind of low level for certain very particular specific contexts. But fundamentally, I'm an enabler. And I think Michael combines those two things. So he's a director, but he's also an enabler as part of his practice.
And so how did you start working together?
So I think at some point, through these informal over-dinner dialogues and a sense of solidarity and kindred spirit, we would get quite practical in part of our conversations about how we were going to approach Creative Europe or Erasmus as the cultural, educational main areas of funding that we were going to try to access outside the UK system, if you like.
Practical for making the projects happen, or even practical creatively thinking about the...
Well, I mentioned earlier the dynamic between the aesthetics, the politics and the economics, and it seems to me that in addition to Michael's talent as a thinker and a practitioner, he also writes extremely good funding bids, which is why he's able to access funds, because he knows how to do that and he's very good at it. And I think that, and I suspect Josephine is too, and I think that those skill sets that mean that you understand the art, you understand the politics, and you understand the economics, and you can move dynamically between those three, institutions don't tend to be set up in that kind of way. They tend to separate out those functions and have artistic people who go, darling, I don't do the money. And then, executive people who are all about, if you like, the economics, and then the politics might be a conversation between the two. That's a very kind of bald analysis, but they don't tend to be concentrated in individual people. The downside of that is that it's a lot of work. The upside of that is that you have more freedom. So in spotting those kind of kindred spirits, then the process in which you work out what you're going to do together and how is likely to be a synthesis of, well, we have a broad shared political kind of set of beliefs and visions of the world. We understand the relationship between the making of art and the funding and the requirements of funding that go with it. We understand the contingencies of what it is to be either freelance or small scale. And so all of those things suggest that there could be a good, useful, collaborative working relationship. My training is as a director, but probably my instincts really are dramaturgical. And so in that sense, as a kind of, if we take a broad dramaturgical understanding of what that means, so not a kind of narrow production focused, but actually the dramaturgy of the project, the dramaturgy of the interrelationship between the aesthetic, the politic and the economic, then we can see how potentially there could be synergies and distinctive roles. So Michael might lead a project. He might have a directorial overview or be one of those. My place as a dramaturg is someone who understands those things, but that can shift around and not contest that, but hopefully add value and catalytic function by being mobile within a particular program or project. And so functionally, we can see that there is scope for collaboration. Then practically it becomes about, well, for a long time, Michael might say, I've been interested in this, and these are the relationships, and this is where we've got to, and here's an opportunity that seems to present itself. Would you be interested in being? And that's also because we both, one of the acts of solidarity and similarities that we found, and something that I think consolidated the slightly abstract origins of our coming together, is Brexit, our response to Brexit, because my response to Brexit early on was, okay, it's not sustainable in a meaningful way, in a political way, to have a European-centred and then more broad than European network, if actually we are in a Brexit moment of British withdrawal from European engagement and participation. And so quite rapidly, after the 2016 vote, we set about researching where else we might go. We set up a small team from the Fence Network to look at that. Quite quickly, we came to a short list of 2, and then we talked to people in both those countries, and in 2017, we moved the network to Stockholm, where it's been headquartered ever since. And so that was our solution. Michael's solution took longer, but was to open a cousin branch of border crossings in Sligo on the northwest coast of Ireland. And so we both made those kind of responses, and were able to share thinking and intelligence and issues and the problems and opportunities of doing that. So that was a contextual thing. And then CRE-ACTORS became the practical project that we first worked on together, funded by the European Union's Erasmus Plus project, where we at the Swedish-based Fence Network would offer a dramaturgical support to the process of the 3 other partner companies, border crossings, in this case from Sligo in Ireland, Teatro dell'Argine from San Lazzaro on the outskirts of Bologna in Italy, and certain members of the company of the Théâtre du Soleil in Paris, spending a week in each other's cities, spaces, fundamentally learning about the working methodology of intercultural theatre making. All 3 companies had very different approaches, very different structures, very different trajectories. All have been going between 30 and 60 years, and so long established. But in terms of how they practically worked with issues of interculturalism, very different, and therefore very interesting, very illuminating, very challenging. All of the things that you would hope for from a kind of collaborative learning, exploration process. And as dramaturgs, we were, I suppose, able to look at the dramaturgy of the project and those processes, and use our narrative skills in evaluation, in catalysing that process, I suppose.
Catalysing.
Yeah, because I think at best that's what dramaturgy is. It's catalytic function, and the necessary or appropriate or useful catalysis depends on the particular circumstances of the project at any given moment. But as Cathy Turner and Sin Berendt say in their rather good book on dramaturgy, dramaturgy is not so much about systematization and management, they say. It's more about a responsiveness and an ability to both facilitate and critique. So I really like that as a kind of modus operandi and a kind of practical spirit guide. And I think that's what we bring to the partnership. And then, of course, out of that shared learning exploration that we were able to undertake, largely during COVID, actually, working with the restrictions, which was a huge boon, because it meant that having been denied the opportunity to come together collaboratively and work, which is sort of the bread and butter of why people do theatre, I think, we were able to find ways to do that during COVID, when we would somehow occupy those moments when there were relaxation in the rules. And out of that, of course, grew the current project, The Legend of Europa, that we're working on, which was the logical next step to that process-focused learning, exchange and sharing, which was to say, well, what about if we then take that learning and apply it to a co-production that we build collaboratively towards a template? And of course, that's what we're doing now.
And I ask you more about CRE-ACTORS and the Europa project, the Legend of Europa. What do you think were your shared feelings about Brexit and about having to find a base elsewhere in Europe?
So I think for Michael, because in a way, Border Crossings had been established as a company that made work, he had to think carefully about what that would mean. And it wasn't about moving the company to Sligo. It was about opening up a sister company in Sligo and maintaining a careful balance between the two in terms of governance and in terms of having a British identity, but also an Irish identity. For us, it was easier because as a network and an informal network at that, having been well resourced in our birth and incubation phases because we'd accessed EU Equal and then EU Culture Programme funding in the noughties, when both of those things existed. In a sense, our philosophy had always been that idea that the centre is everywhere and that we don't want to replicate institutional behaviour and we don't want to establish ourselves as a kind of institution. And so the fence is a strange beast in many ways in that it doesn't maintain a fixed paid bureaucracy. It doesn't behave like a conventional membership network. There are 300 members, you don't pay to be a member, it's free. It's a collaborative, cooperative model that is distributed and people come together to make something happen when there is reason to do so, and then they find the necessary resources. But what we don't do is skew that by saying, well, we must have a fixed administrative infrastructure and then a contractual arrangement between that fixed administrative infrastructure and the 300 members who are paying a membership fee and therefore not unreasonably expect something for their fee. And then it becomes actually about that and everything else becomes sort of attendant on that. And I didn't want to do that because I know what that looks like. And it's a choice. So you move away from the kind of apparent solidity of that towards a different kind of paradigm, where sometimes you're going to make money because if you are successful in applying for projects, then you can pay yourself for that project work. And other times you're not going to make money. But the value in what happens in terms of your professional development makes it worthwhile. And also you are effectively constructing a capital base of interrelationships and the attendant institutions that you might then access through those relationships. And that's, well, you could probably pull that through into some kind of economic value and it would be quite significant. So it's a very different way, I suppose, of thinking. But Michael had a much more conventional obligations in terms of it's a company producing theatre and therefore they had a different kind of, and it took longer, I think, inevitably, because it wasn't difficult for us to go, okay, let's put together a board, right, let's get a bank account, okay, let's, because one of the board members, was Swedish and knew how to do that, and often we attract hybrid artists who also have multiple identities and functions and skill sets, and so we were able to effect that quite quickly. It takes much longer, of course, if you want to start engaging with Sweden and engaging with Ireland, and you have to start to build those relationships with the economic political context, very different between Sweden and Ireland. And Michael and I think, are both in the process of doing that. So he's building a set of conversations with Irish funders and policymakers to see how the Sligo branch of Border Crossings can add value to what happens in Ireland.
very interesting.
And we're doing something similar, I guess, in Sweden. It's taking longer, and Sweden, in a way, is bigger and has a much more developed infrastructure, I would say, than Ireland.
It's very interesting that you as a dramaturg and him as a director, before working in this capacity together, you were obviously sharing more structural thinking of both your companies. That's very special, isn't it, to have with someone, with a company?
Yeah, but I've always, I know that I flourish by being able to have those associations. And in a way, what underpins everything is trust. So our entire network is predicated on trust because there is no financial security. And so the cooperation that I talk about, the collaboration, it has to work relationally, and it has to work on a basis of I respect you and I trust you until such time as it's necessary for me not to. But mostly that doesn't happen because of the way in which hopefully you position your praxis and your discourse. And that those things, it seems to me, are longer lasting. And that's crucial because I think often theatre is a very quick churn, Certainly in this country, the way in which the industry organises itself, it's like you bang through and there's a kind of fantastic overproductivity, which has many virtues, but also some downsides too, not least burnout and the kind of relentless commodification of neophytes, I would say. And so the problematics of an undercapitalised sector that doesn't properly look at the underlying economic and political realities of a furiously free market overproductive set of processes that actually churn through human capital at a very fast rate. And so applying that thinking means being slower, being more deliberate, not jumping into that machine, finding ways to do things that take longer, that are more fractured, that are more discontinuous, but worth it because they allow you to create a different kind of space, and that's crucial. And so again, that kind of sense of, Josephine and Michael and I are all different, and we do things in different ways, and we have different manifestations, of course we do, but I think we're all influenced by some of those qualities that we want to resist that kind of churn, even though sometimes you have to go in and dance with institutions, but you always get to step back from the dance and move around. And so that kind of freedom and mobility that I mentioned earlier, I think is probably crucial to all of us. But it's necessary to feed your soul because we know that the feeding of the body is going to be limited. And most of us have got other gigs outside this world which help to sustain it. And so I have a .4 post at Goldsmiths where I'm a lecturer in arts management and cultural policy, which is not completely unrelated, but it's not exactly what, dramaturgs necessarily are first and foremost known for. So it's a complex kind of culture of our own work that I guess we create and curate. And I think we were fortunate in that we're all between 50 and 65, I would say, me, Josephine and Michael. And so we all were able to do this at a particular moment in UK political and economic history. I benefited, for example, not from a Labour Party government investment in culture, although that happened in the late 90s and I did benefit. But I first benefited as a young person by the Conservative Party and their commitment to entrepreneurship and setting up the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which meant for people around 60 of my age, I was able to cut my teeth in my 20s, doing a lot of education community-based work around Norfolk, Suffolk, East Anglia, without anybody hassling us, because we were a new business. We were a theatre company that we set up back at my old university, the first theatre company in residence at UEA. We did it for 3 years until we got our equity cards, which at that point was the way into the profession. And we were very fortunate to be able to do that, because for 3 years we could learn our craft, we could build those relationships with schools and community, and the local authorities across Norfolk and Suffolk. They later paid for my director training at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, Norfolk County Council, because that was still a thing that you could do, and because they knew my work, because we'd presented to them, and they were familiar with the work that we'd done. And this was all part of a landscape, political economic landscape, that is completely gone. And so we're conscious of the exigencies, I think, of the fact that we're the age that we are, and you've always got to build those models in a way that is hopefully successfully bridging your own sensibilities, your own self-reflections about how you do and don't work well, with the contingencies of the macro-political and macroeconomic circumstances that surround you at any given point. So I don't know how replicable any of this would be for anybody starting now, because it's very different.
And how did you find the other companies? Let's go back to CRE-ACTORS.
Yeah.
So Bologna, Paris.
Yeah. So Mike, those were Michael's relationships, and Michael had met Dominique and Vincent from the Théâtre du Soleil at some industry gathering, symposium, probably something like that, where he'd been invited to speak, and got talking to them and clearly kind of went, "Oh, you're good. You're interesting. Is there a way in which we might begin to continue exploring something?"
Did you feel the same?
Because I talked about trust, and so because I trust Michael, that's it. It doesn't matter. I'm not worried about whether or not I'm going to think the same thing about his choices, because once I trust somebody, I found it utterly counterproductive to do anything other than continue to trust in them. So that's the crucial decision. If I trust somebody and they say, these partners are great, fabulous, on we go. My task is to try and, insert myself into and whoever I'm bringing with me into that mix in a way that adds value, because that's the game, it seems to me. And so, and of course you're going to encounter all kinds of challenges, and you're going to have to work through stuff together, because that's the nature of the beast. But it was very much Michael's project, Michael's vision, Michael's drive, and I was very happy for us to be implicated in that mix.
How did you feel these companies navigated through their big changes that you mentioned earlier that happened here in Britain, but also over Europe? Brexit is the name of something else worldwide, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think Brexit is a very kind of peculiar... The only way I've been able to make sense of it is to say, when there's nothing left to colonise, the colonising impetus, which is so strong and has been so strong for so long, turns in on itself. So Brexit for me was an act of self-colonisation. Because rather than look at the implications of empire and its loss, and the fact that we've gone from number 1 dog to number 6.5 or whatever, and it's only going to go that way because India's coming, Indonesia's coming, of course. How could they not? So it's a very, very particular form of denial, and continued denial. And in many ways, the chaos of the Conservative government, yes, it's disaster capitalism. Yes, it's about a kind of model, certainly around Johnson, which basically says, I'm in charge and we can do what we want. But again, trying to find a logic for it, I reached for the British East India Company, which was a kind of a licensed piracy, and I imagined that what some of the conscious or subconscious thinking around Brexit and its kind of Conservative Party management, was to create a new kind of nation state, because they could see that the nation state is in crisis, certainly in the Westphalian sense of the nation state. It doesn't make sense anymore. The way governments behave don't make sense anymore. And part of that is because we're still working to a map of the world that doesn't have a global multinational overlay. Only when you start to look at those two things in relationship to each other can you begin to understand any kind of discernible meaningful logic as to the way in which governments do and don't behave, it seems to me. And so my sense of Brexit was that it was a kind of, apart from being the dog's breakfast that it was kind of at its most coherent, a will, if you like, to create a kind of Cayman Island type offshore banking business that would have license piracy, because the British East India Company had its own coinage, its own laws. It was free to go wherever it was. The British, like the Dutch, construct their identity around a military base that is fundamentally naval. It's not land-based in the way in which many people have the army as their central mode of operation. And ours is not that. It's the water, it's the seas, it's navy, it's license piracy. So in that sense, my experience of Britain, or at least my understanding of it, is that it's a very particular kind of post-colonial trembling, if you like, in the sense of tremblement du terre, earthquake. And its ripples go back 400 years, not just 4 in terms of the apparent mechanics of Brexit. But everyone's negotiating their identity. So the Italians, the reality of Italian cultural funding is that they've got a lot of heritage. And so they're very focused on that because that brings in tourist dollar. I've lived in Florence for 3 of the last 4 years, although I'm back in London now. And so I had a little bit of an up-close experience of what that was like, where you've got a kind of hyper-focus on heritage and tourism. And they're very good at it. Of course they are. But it means that for the rest of culture, whoa, compared to the UK, where we think we have very underfunded culture, try working in Italy. So they're working with all kinds of contingencies, where the sunflower model, where you have a kind of a centre, but you've also got these large petals, is very much the image of how I see Teatro dell'Argine having to work. So although they have some kind of large centre, they've got to have all these big yellow petals that are also having to be tended and delivered in order to actually have a sustainable structure. And that's very challenging. The French are a completely different beast again. So what they are is a huge company with a 60-year tradition, extremely well established, iconic, 70 of them, so vast. And the 2 people that are the key people within that, Dominique and Vincent, long-standing members. And so it's great to have access to those resources, that wonderful space at the Cartoucherie, where we get to work, which is an enormous privilege. And they are, of course, fantastic, as indeed are our Italian colleagues at Teatro dell'Argine. So it's a great privilege to work with all of the artists from those companies. But the challenge with the French is that they are working to a kind of very, very particular French way of doing things. And even within that French particularity, a very particular way in which Ariane Manouchkine organises that company and its work. So what you're encountering are different systems, different cultures, different practices, different political and economic circumscriptions that impact practically how you work together. But as I say, it's very simple. I trust Michael, and so all those contingencies and exigencies and contradictions and challenges are absolutely worthwhile, because it's, in the end, it's his judgment to go, I think we would make a good team. I think these would be good people to work together. And because we'd already worked on the CRE-ACTORS project, we'd got to know each other with our strengths and weaknesses and understand some of the contingencies within which the Irish, the Italian, the Swedes, the French, and then subconsciously, tacitly, the British, are kind of working with.
As a dramaturg, and when I read your website, I see that the playwright is important on the Fences website, or yours, I don't remember.
Yeah.
And then, am I right in thinking that within CRE-ACTORS it was a lot of devised work, and your job as critical and evaluation role I'm just interested in how does it sit with you being really out of script work somehow. Am I right?
Yeah, so I suppose the thinking around that goes back to my work as director of New Playwrights Trust and WriterNet, where I was, in order to diversify the talent pool, immediately you've got to start thinking about, well, what functionally does a playwright do? What's their function? What's their role? And what's the context in which they work? And that broadening that definition, certainly taking it out of the kind of literary ghetto in which, if you're not careful, it can end up, is really important. So first of all, we go back to the word, which is not a playwrighter, it's a playwright, like a wheelwright or a shipwright. And those are makers. They make ships, they make wheels, they make plays. So immediately we're moving away from the tyranny of words and the tyranny of literature and the kind of dominant discourse that is assumed, attendant on all that. That's not to say that that's not great, because it is. But if you want to diversify things, you want to recognize that as one way of doing things, not the only way of doing things. And that playwrights might then come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and might want to work in all kinds of different ways. And that if you say to a playwright, there are certain playwrights who will talk about composition, either from a visual sense or a musical sense. And you can see in the work of certain playwrights that they're absolutely drawing on visual art in terms of the way in which they organise their thinking, and music in terms of the way in which they approach things like structure, for example. So this idea of somehow a discrete, literary, ghettoised art form seems to me to be incredibly reductive. And so part of my ethos has always been to expand that, to challenge that. Then you've got the idea of the single authorial voice, the playwright. And that's important on one level, because if they are being marginalised or excluded for economic or political reasons, it's cheaper to produce a dead playwright than a living one. Well, we need to do something about that. If it's about we're not prepared to produce certain voices because they don't sit with the politics of the times, well, we need to do something about that. But actually, there's no point in breaking down certain tyrannies within the theatrical infrastructure if all you're going to do is swap them with your own, because that's Frantz Fanon. That's like the oppressed starts on taking on the mechanics and in an unconscious way the belief systems of the oppressor. So I'm not wedded to the tyranny of the playwright as the individual author. I'm interested in ways in which voices get explored within theatrical processes, particularly if you're talking about the relationship between theatre makers and certain constituencies or communities. So if you're talking about migrants, if you're talking about different community voices, it seems to me to be instantly problematic. It's one of the reasons why I have a particular difficulty with the term verbatim, because I feel that it locks things in a kind of ultimately disingenuous way and becomes commodified. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I was much younger, I worked for a wonderful American television writer as his kind of personal script editor, if you like. And at the time, he was being employed to write television movies of the week. Television movies of the week went through a phase of being based on a true story because that was the cachet. And so this guy would meticulously research the true story. He'd go and talk to people, he'd make sure he had all the documentation, and then he'd write the draft, and then he'd go through various drafts and various meetings back in Los Angeles with script executives and producers and script editors and so on. And then it would get to a kind of final stage where it would go to the lawyers. And the lawyers would simply go, nope, can't say that, nope, we're not having that, nope, 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 nope. And so all of that work would have to be jettisoned so that he could fictionalise something that would not be in any way, shape or form potentially litigious. So you can see in that kind of arc the sort of ridiculous contradiction between based on a true story and the actuality. And in the end, what had to happen is that he was returned to his imaginative properties and powers, which is probably what made him be a writer in the first place. So I'm reluctant to be dogmatic about this, and I won't, as a dramaturg, to poke at things, and that includes the individual playwright. That doesn't mean that I've abandoned the playwright, quite the opposite, but it does mean that we take a multiplicity of views, and that actually we can see from the processes. So once you start to dig into those companies and how they work, not just on the CRE-ACTORS project, which was very particular in terms of an exchange, and not just on the Legend of Europa, but you can see that Ariane Manouchkine works with Hélène Sixou and as a kind of key figure in the company. In Teatro dell'Argine, Niccolo Banazzi is also, as a playwright, is a key figure in that company too. It's just we're not starting with the playwright and a commission and the play text. That's not how they work. So they work with playwrights, but the playwrights are very much part of a developmental, devising, constructing process that's one of many voices in the mix. So the playwright's not erased, it's just they're relocated. And I think that's absolutely fine.
So you're the key figure of the Legend of Europa?
No, I'm not at all. As hopefully will become clear from our conversation, I go back to this notion of catalysis and catalytic function. So my job is to analyse, to reflect, and to try to respond depending on what the needs might be. But the writing will happen in the sense of the scribing of a part of a process in a scene or an act or a part of a scene from very different places. So the point about being CRE-ACTORS is you're creative, you're creating. It might come from a performance, but the writers might be the directors, might be the dramaturgs, might be the actors, or all three. It's not fixed. And I think that's what's important, is that there is a fluidity to the collaborative building, and that you need that because it's always a negotiation. It has to be.
And how does this work impact or has impacted your work, your own work, your journey, this work with Border Crossings, this place as a dramaturg?
So my work as a dramaturg is it's often, it's not even within the, if one can say, a conventional approach to dramaturgy. Maybe dramaturgy's been around now 30 years, long enough in this country for people to at least have thought about it a bit, and for it not to be completely alien to them as a thing. But in some ways, mine has always been applied. So I would apply the dramaturgical practices and principles to a 10-year relationship with 6 theatre companies who all make professional touring theatre with learning disabled, neurodivergent, autistic theatre makers. And the dramaturgy has only on occasion been about individual shows and largely not. It's much more been about that partnership, its sustainability, its growth, and the projects that we might do together. I finished that piece of work with those people because there was a kind of logical, we've reached the end of the road with this. So in that sense, the dramaturgy is not traditional, let us say, insofar as there is a tradition. Certainly not in terms of how one might understand it either in the United States or in Germany, where it has a more dominant place within the cultures and is much more related, certainly in the German-speaking world, to institutional dramaturgs as part of the established landscape of theatre institutions. But I'm happy to kind of use that as a wider way of describing what I do, simply because I've always struggled to describe what I do, because it's a variation of different functions depending partly on context. And this idea of facilitation and critique and responsiveness means that it's going to vary inevitably. But I suppose what's particularly pleasurable for me is that it does give me a very concrete opportunity to be in rehearsal rooms and theatres working with artists, but also to do the other thing that I do, which is manage all the things that need to happen in terms of a project and its development outside of the rehearsal rooms, because we only get 3 7-day opportunities. We've had our Irish one, we've had our Italian one, we'll have our French one in the summer, and at some point we've got to transform all of that alchemically into a showcase that will happen in Sweden. as the culmination of this project. And a lot of it is about the work in between. So in a way that plays into my skill set because it's one that moves between the economics, the politics and the aesthetics. It's constantly moving back and forth between those three things. But in the end, it's very material in the sense of the materiality of theatre making, because it's a company of 20 and there'll be 13 people on stage. And so it's very much focused on a production that we are iteratively building together. And hopefully we'll, in the next project, get to actually make and tour.
And going to something quite personal, and also my brother is autistic, so it touches me personally. Do you feel that your work and maybe with border crossings and broader has influenced your other job as a dad? You know.
Wow, that's a huge question.
Is that okay?
It's absolutely okay. It's absolutely okay. I can't imagine how it couldn't. It must do. But it's not a question I get asked very often, so I'm having to think about it. What would I say? So, yes, I'm sure it does. And I'm sure that there is a kind of corollary between some of the functions that I've described, because they're attributes of me. And I think if I go back to my own experience, I think it was the 6th time I've been interviewed by the BBC, probably for some sort of script editing job. And I think by the time I got to the 6th interview and failed the interview, I kind of, the penny very slowly began to drop, that maybe it wasn't about my skill set, my level of experience, my competencies. It was about something else. And maybe it was just that the BBC was not an institution that I was going to be comfortable working in. And so consciously or otherwise, I was sending signals fundamentally of self-sabotage, which were basically, you don't want to work with me, because I wasn't able to articulate, actually, I don't want to work with you. And so sometimes that learning takes a while to process. And I think one of the things that I had to go through as the father of an autistic son was particularly an autistic son that has difficulty with language. He's not nonverbal, but he has almost dyspraxia, and he has certain issues in terms of how he's able to talk. He has a limited vocabulary that is not the same as his understanding, which is far in excess of that. It's just that I think probably he experiences the world visually or visuospatially, and therefore he's constantly having to adapt to a second language. So you can immediately see one of the ways in which I transpose my understanding and learning of intercultural devising and what it is to work across languages is to recognize that I see my son as someone who, when I talk to him and listen to him in his speed of processing and the lags, I simply imagine that it must be at best a second language, if not a third or fourth language equivalent, that he's constantly being asked to engage in, because he's having to translate everything from his visuospatial intelligence into a language where he has literal difficulties in formulating words. And therefore there is a radical disjuncture between what he understands, which clearly is way different than what he's able to articulate. So immediately you can see that this is how I will think about things. In a way, there is no distinction, there is no separation. Which came first? Really interesting. I don't know. I don't know which came first, because I don't believe in a kind of linear, logical sequential. I used the word osmosis at the beginning of our conversation, and I'm a huge believer in that kind of gradual porousness where things percolate and kind of interconnect. And sometimes you have a moment of insight, or you experience as a moment of insight, but almost certainly that moment has been gradually arrived at and multifactorially. So I had to learn to abandon all the things that I'm good at: language, articulation, thinking on my feet. and recognized that that wasn't going to get him anywhere. That wasn't going to help him. And I had to kind of learn how to not do that and to try and occupy a different space where fundamentally, again, I could go back to a different part of theatre, where you go, put your shoulders squarely towards somebody else in the room and something else slightly changes. What happens when you do that? So get into a physicality that moves you away from the hegemony of the spoken word. And that was much more useful because I realized that both literally and metaphorically, if all I needed to do was square my shoulders to his, the rest would follow, and we're back to trust. So it's, learning. What it boils down to, I suppose, is that in my mind there is a huge connection between, let us say, working interculturally, working transnationally, and understanding the differences across and the human variances across neurodivergence and indeed disability as well. So once you get into disability aesthetics, you start to see the extraordinary levels of corollary between that and working across languages. If you're familiar with the work of Margherita Laera, a kind of leading academic in terms of working across languages, Italian is her background and specialism, but it's really interesting to see how she's recently started to absolutely get interested in disability aesthetics and to see those connections. And we're still, I think, at the infancy of exploring actually what they mean, and that's quite an interesting journey. But it's no surprise that I'm drawn to Michael, because, my colleague and dear friend Edward Buffalo Bromberg, who is my other dramaturg on this project, also has an autistic son. These aren't, they're not necessarily conscious choices. It's not like, so they're not the first thing that I learn about somebody. Usually it happens considerably later in the process. But clearly there's something about a worldview or a sensibility, genetic or environmental, that connects me to certain individuals.
And are these things you end up talking about with Michael, for example, or it's just seeps through the practice?
It depends. So sometimes there'll be a practical challenge where your child is reaching a point in their late teenage or early 20s years, and you've got to encounter a different set of structural obstacles. And so, of course, then we would have a conversation. If I go round to their house and Nisha, his wife, is there, then not surprisingly, that conversation has a different context because it's the domestic context. And so we might well gravitate quite quickly towards that. I'm a big believer that just because you have an autistic child, it's still up to you to go to your wardrobe every morning and go, right, who am I today? Which of my sub-personalities are coming out to play? And sometimes you are warrior dad, and woe betide anyone that fucks with you because you're wearing your armour and you're going into battle because you have to. And other days, no, armour's heavy, man, and you're tired, and you've got that lovely sparkly dress, and that's what's coming out to play. So I'm kind of mindful that I don't make assumptions about any dads, mums, carers, anybody else, and what they want to wear on any particular day. Again, the job is to facilitate, critique, and be responsive. It's not to systematise and manage. It's the same principle, I have to allow people to be the complete set of sub-personalities that they want to be on any given day, because one of the things that you'll know as the parent of an autistic child is that there are contingencies and you have to be adaptive to them. Yeah.
And they influence also your work then?
They do, because in a way what of course I've constructed is, and it's interesting because the next thing I'm going to go to is another 30-year celebration, which is 30 years of the master's programme on which I teach at Goldsmiths. And the guy who set it up retired last year, the wonderful Gerald Lidstone, and so partly it's a celebration of him. But what he has enabled me to do is to be flexible around my work. And that's partly because as an academic who came from stage management in his case, but the sector, he values sectoral knowledge, sectoral experience that is brought to the academic world. And so he's flexible in that way, in terms of allowing me the flexibility to do the projects and externally based work that I do. But at the same time, he was also aware, I'm sure, the fact that I was raising a disabled autistic child, and therefore that flexibility is built into, it becomes the number one priority in terms of what I needed to do to construct a workable professional life that would have the fluidity and flexibility for me to say at certain periods I may need to do different things. I mean, in fact, my son Gabriel is extremely easy and has been for the last 20 years. The first few, not so much. We were still figuring shit out. But, you know, but that in a way set the template. What am I going to need to do? You know, I'm in my late 30s. I've got an autistic kid. Okay, I'm going to need to construct a professional life that means that either I'm in charge, or when I'm not in charge, I've got flexibility.
And I think this is my last question, but also then working with Michael in Border Crossings, do you think that you already said that your work is all of course influenced by this personal experience? Do you see in Michael's work, in Border Crossings work, how this also impacts the work they do, this personal background?
Well, look, you were at the checkpoint evening of presentation of the 30-year arc of Border Crossings work on a week ago last Friday. And, you know, it culminated in Michael's written piece of a kind of post-Prospero world, but delivered by his wife, the actor, Nisha. And, you know, my observation to Nisha and to Michael afterwards was, this is fantastic in all sorts of different ways. And I enjoy the ideas, as I always do with Michael. But it's also a love letter from Michael to his wife. Of course it is. How could it not be? Because Border Crossings can't happen without her. Border Crossings cannot happen without her. And A, it's a great pleasure to see Nisha on stage because she's such an affecting performer. But B, it's also a great pleasure because there's so much tenderness in the writing and his creation of something that she can step into, because she doesn't often get the chance, because she is the primary carer. Now, as the dad of an autistic child, there's something particularly resonant and rich and deep and meaningful and pleasurable that I don't expect most people who don't know those circumstances to get. And that's fine, because that wasn't why it was done.
Is there anything you want to add?
Just that it's been a great pleasure and privilege to work alongside Michael, to learn with him and from him, to trust him, to have his trust in me, where, because there I think is a great mutual respect, we can disagree with each other, you know, but listen to each other, listen to the disagreement, and work it through. And I'm, you know, Mike is one of those people where if he says something or if we disagree, I know that I've got to give it house room, because however I might feel in the moment, you know, I respect the way in which he thinks, and I respect his judgment. And that sounds straightforward, but it isn't, and it's not easy. And I think that it's partly a sensibility, partly an openness, but also I think a lot of us want to be generous, and I think some people find different ways to do that. And I think that we've all got blind spots, and we've all got areas of where we don't see that we're not succeeding in that. And I think Michael is A, he succeeds in that more than most people. But B, when he does have blind spots, he's willing, even if it's painful, to kind of look at them And that's impressive, I think. Yeah.
Do you recall any special moment, like maybe a common light bulb moment in the room, in the rehearsal room, or
I don't think there is. I think for me it's not about those individual moments. It's more about a sensibility, I think, in the end. Um, um, yeah. Um, yes, it is. It isn't about moments. It's very much about a sensibility, and that sensibility is it's experienced over time, and so it's appreciated over time. These relational time spans, seems to me, are what has become much more interesting to me in terms of a process.
how do you feel about the fact that they've reached 30 years? That's quite something. I mean, has your company, I think.
So the fence is 23,
Okay.
22. 22. Yeah, I mean, I think. So for me, it's not just about 30 years. It's like 30 years and still interesting, and still engaging, and still challenging, and still wrestling, and still working stuff out, and still not complacent. It's all of those things. It's all of those things. Because sometimes you can be 30 years and you're an aspic, you know? And that's not my experience. And so just Michael's ability to think. I mean, it's really basic, really simple, but I'm also drawn to that. Someone's basic ability to think. If you look at the way in which he and Lucy and others constructed the evening of Checkpoint, where you sort of go, imagine that there are different temporal arrows moving in parallel. So get young people iteratively in different constructions and groups to kind of present in relationship. And it doesn't matter that it's not kind of polished, high-end stuff. What it is about engagement, but it also constructs a counter-narrative in the audience mind, which isn't just about let's go back in history. It's let's go back in history, but let's punctuate it with different groups of younger people and what they have to say that is meaningful to them now. So you might go, well, why would you have, in response to Gaza monologues, which is a very particular set of circumstances, why would you respond to that with COVID monologues? You know, and you might see the disjuncture to begin with. But then after a while, you understand within the overall pattern and therefore framing of the evening and what is the space you as a spectator are being invited to step into, is that actually it's because you've got to start where people are. And in this case, the Gaza monologues won't mean that much to a group of 14 and a half, 15-year-old young people. Necessarily, it might. But COVID monologues was something they all went through. And just in that sense of experiencing kind of dislocation and alienation in their young teenage lives. And so it's that, and it's that idea of multiple spaces of dialogue. So he's not saying it's either X or Y. He's saying, let's just give you these two things in relationship to each other. Step into that space. But that we had so many variants on that. So that fabulous 30-year-old arc where you had those wonderful two South Asian actors who were the original South Asian actors from the piece, you know, re-inhabiting that space was a completely different version of the same pattern. And there's a great pleasure in that, because you understand that those are very, very, very different axes. They're very different interpretations of what 30 years might mean, or what a different spatial understanding might mean, or how to create a space into which an audience might step. And for me, it's that variety and it's that space that is the hallmark of Michael and Border Crossing's work. And that's what makes him and them special.
And sorry, another one. You mentioned dash arts. I'm familiar with dash arts, but do you know any other spaces, like spaces as in mental spaces like Border Crossing?
I suspect there are all kinds of things. Yeah. I mean, I think looking at different ways in which people create spaces, I was very taken with the way in which Alan Lane created Slung Low, for example, up in Yorkshire. I love the original Arcola theatre before it had to move in its original space opposite Mungal 2 in Arcola Street. And often, thinking about it, it's because of there are often interesting mixes. So if I think about Mehmet and then Ben and Layla as the triumvirate, but particular Mehmet, you kind of go, I think it once described himself as an entrepreneurial Marxist. And if you think about that across a kind of London-Istanbul axis, you know, you could shoot that down in flames probably quite quickly, certainly now. But at the time, when he first was, was doing that 25 years ago. And with Alan, you can see, because of where he's now working as well, which is the Edinburgh Tattoo, he has a very strong military background in terms of his continuing involvement with the TA and growing up within that kind of world. And often in the arts, we go, well, we're not going there because it's military. And of course, on a certain political level, I can understand that. But actually, what Alan does is he embraces a lot of the practicalities, a lot of the discipline, a lot of the thinking, actually, that goes with military practices. And he applies it creatively in a very different kind of community arts setting, if you like. And so I think there are interesting people like Mehmet, like Alan, and many others who are dotted around the world, who, because of their different sensibilities, create these spaces.
And yourself and Border Crossings are part of this ecology. Do you feel that also? Do you feel that there's a legacy? Do you feel that there's also already something after all these years of working that is seeping in the theatre world?
I don't know. I'm probably the wrong person to ask in that sense, because I'm not. I've never been very focused on legacy. I think part of trusting is you trust the people, and you trust the process, and what comes out is what comes out. So my attention is not on what will be the legacy of my work or the legacy of what the Fence Network has done or created. And I suspect that's both a good and bad thing. I think in the end that'll be for other people to judge. We are not a particularly externally focused network. We have a website, but we don't particularly spend time and energy in embracing ways to promote the network. We're quite happy to just do what we do with the people that we do it with, and it has its own value. And the people who will derive benefit from it will be the people who help make it happen. And that was always the idea, that it's collaborative. Peter Arnott, who was one of the 4 people that helped me set it up, along with Sarah Dickinson, Gabriel Badamosi and Kate O'Reilly, said our project is each other. And that's one of the kind of guiding spirits. And so given that, I'm not expecting the legacy and impact to be anything other than that. And that is also something that and maybe this is also goes back to your question about how has your work been in relationship to your job as a dad? And I've kind of gone, there are things that I can have control over and the things that I can't have control over. And so let me try and pay attention to the things that I might have control over and not worry about the other stuff. And so what our legacy will be, what our impact will be, because we don't maintain a fixed bureaucracy, because therefore I don't have a funding agreement with anybody beyond a meeting or a project. I'm not obligated to construct those narratives and to invest in time doing so. And so I choose to spend my time investing in the network meetings and the projects that we can make happen, because I think that's where the value lies.
Do you think Border Crossings also doesn't really think about legacy, or how do you see their?
No, I think they do, and this is a question I've started to ask Michael, because I've kind of gone, well, I'm 63 and Michael's not far behind, so at some point you kind of go, okay. With me, it's about recognizing that I have a very particular sensibility and I occupy a very particular space at a very particular time, and therefore the replicability of that in terms of somebody else stepping in, that's quite a big ask. And so if the fence is going to have a life after me, what are the necessary conditions that might need to be created for that to increase in terms of its possibility, but in a way that hopefully will not destroy its ethos, but won't necessarily look like me. And there's a kind of a counter argument which goes, Michael has been axiomatic to border crossings, and therefore if the question is what kind of border crossings is there after Michael isn't in it anymore, might well be, well, there isn't a border crossings after Michael isn't in it anymore. And that's also a completely legitimate response. What one's got to do, I suppose, as the kind of prime movers, is figure out what you think. So I thought before COVID that we were building a kind of momentum that would allow me to kind of go, okay, I can see myself stepping back from this and maybe participating as just an average Joe. Yeah, great theory. But then COVID came and it became apparent to me that because what COVID was very good at was ripping the covers off certain things and going, no, that's what they look like, in a different way. And so I kind of, okay, that's not going to work. I'm going to have to do a next phase that is going to be about something else if we're going to meaningfully ask somebody else to step in. So I'm paying attention to certain things now, starting to look at how the people do that. My friend Kate Hall has just stepped away from Jumped Up, which she made into a very successful and funded theatre company in Peterborough over the last 10 years, but has had a much longer 20 plus year arc since her London days. And I'm really curious to see what happens, because she's literally stepped away and gone, okay, somebody else comes in. So that's going to be an interesting thing for me to look at. And obviously, I dare say that conversation with Michael will get revisited. So Michael, what are your thoughts about border crossings now you've clocked up 30? You're not going to make another 30, matey, are you? So, you might still be here, inshallah, that's quite possible. But at some point, you're going to have to, hang up your clogs. Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see. But I think theatre is, how can I put this? I'm just thinking about this idea because it's two things that have come together in my mind. One of the problems we face as a global society is that the techno-capitalists' fascination with Godhead and extending their life forever, and this kind of fascination with immortality. One of the great things about theatre is that it dies. It's ephemeral. That's the point. And that seems to me to be utterly analogous to human beings as a species. We die. That's what makes us human. So the whole kind of post-human world or universe, yeah. So there's something about legacy and impact that I think, for me, those terms relate to its ephemerality. We're gone. And we know that society does that anyway with older people. It tends to kind of rapidly erase them and focus on something newer and sexier. And I'm kind of under no illusions about that. But that's why I think constructing a parallel narrative about what constitutes value is really important, because in the end, I think on this earth, we only ever compete with ourselves, actually. And so other people might say all sorts of things, but in the end, we have to somehow work out what our own value is and find a way to validate ourselves. That's quite tricky. It's not an easy exercise. But in the same way that you can't listen to, people that are nasty about you in a way that's nasty, you can't really listen to the opposite either with anything other than the same degree of skepticism. So I think that's our task, is to kind of go, it's ephemeral, it's not designed to be permanent, its impact is what it is. If you're creating spaces for people to step into, that's the job. In the same way that as theatre makers, we know that the meaning of our work happens in the back of our audience's heads. And it's for them to determine that, ultimately, not us. Our job's to make it. My hope is that Michael continues for as long as he is energised and enthusiastic. And there's no shortage of energy and enthusiasm at the moment.
Yeah, you feel that he is...
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think Legend of Europa manifests that really clearly. He has an enormous appetite and energy for the work. And I think as long as he is still creatively stimulated and challenged and driven, I see no dropping off.